This is fantastic. I am so thrilled. This has been in a discussion phase for some time, right, Kelly? This has been discussed. And it's always fun for me to reflect on how serendipity kind of flows into programming here at the Jackson Center. And this is classic stuff. So when, a guy named Jeb DuBois decides to move in next to Marty Idzik. Marty Idzik is a partner of mine at Phillips Lytle. He comes in one day and says, hey, my son Andy hangs around with the DuBois, and do you know anything about them at all? And of course, no. And he said, by the way, Marty did a little research and got a little information that all of a sudden, Jeb's grandfather was in fact a Nuremberg prosecutor. Well, that hits my hot button pretty fast. All of you have been here before, but when a center you have dedicated to the legacy of Robert H. Jackson, a guy from this area who never went to college, never graduated from law school, and as an answer to the Jeopardy question, most recently the final Jeopardy question, by the way, name the only person in the history of the United States who was a Solicitor General, Attorney General, and a Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The answer is, who was Robert H. Jackson? Our guy. This is our guy here. And oh, by the way, he was a chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial. And then, oh, by the way, he's the guy that designated Telford Taylor, who in turn created 12 subsequent trials at Nuremberg, and one of them was headed by a guy named Josiah DuBois, Jr. I'm juiced. I am just juiced. Well, the next thing you know, I probably walked across the street, introduced myself, and I'm sure you said, who's this guy? And next thing you know, he says, is your dad, around? Does he come by? And that then precipitates a tour. Remember, we did a tour, Judy and Bob, we came down here, did a tour, and now the juices are really flowing, and I see Kelly all the time at the IDA, and we talking about, let's do something. Randy Manita sees me at a sportsman's club, and we're sweating profusely, pretending to look like we're working, and we say, let's do something. And of course, nothing just kind of gets over the end zone until enter Mary Lausterer. And I can tell from your laughter, you know that then it's going to happen, the reality of it all. And we meet at Moonbrook. Bob was in town, Judy, everybody was there to kind of see if they're interested. And the answer was, okay, we'll talk about the Farben trial, that's great. Mary's kicked in gear. Randy paid for lunch at Moonbrook, that was good. So in case you see that expense report coming through, you'll just wonder what that's about. But what was really interesting was the fact that the piece that Bob mentioned and the one that Josiah DuBois Jr., who we'll be talking about tonight, is the Farben trial, but also a very important piece of a report that he made as an attorney within the Secretary of the Treasury, entitled The Acquiescence of the United States Government Towards the Murder of Jews. And this report was done in 1944. I really didn't know anything about this. And I was encouraged to kind of, one, learn about it, because you should, Greg. Two, that's probably equally as important, especially in a time like today. So we have that opportunity to talk a little bit about that tonight, and we're privileged, and I'll invite him up in a few minutes, Rob Goldberg, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Buffalo Jewish Federation, to talk about that legacy. But I also want to talk about other serendipities that are occurring here. If Raleigh Kidder were here, he's in Scotland drinking scotch, I guess. He sent me a note, and because we're here also to pause and reflect on that connectiveness, because what I forgot to say was Jeb DuBois has a brother named Rob DuBois. Rob DuBois is married to somebody called Kelly Farrell. Kelly Farrell's family owned Hope's Windows. And Hope's Windows becomes very much part of the Robert H. Jackson Center fabric. When we got started in 2001, this place was a wreck, a mess. Richie's who was here, Rich, you remember that? It was just really tough shape. And one of the worst things was a single-pane wood windows. They were just single-pane. You might as well not have had windows. The utility bills, and Dewey Anderson's here, and he, as the treasurer of the Scottish Rite Consistory, he knew what it was like to do utility bills. So enter Frank, who he came up and thought this is a project which is important for the Jamestown, and that where Hopes can make an imprint, and so they actually designed steel-encased windows, triple pane, that look identical. So much so the historical folks didn't have a clue that it had not been here for 150 years. So, and of course we were broke. And I had Raleigh send me, what happened? How did Frank work this? Because I know he did. And this is classic. He goes, one, I'm going to make them, and I'll install them. And you're going to pay full price because I don't give discounts to anybody. Can you see Frank saying that? And he says, I'm not going to give discounts to anybody, but I tell you what, you don't have to pay for a long period of time. And oh, by the way, he goes, because that's that part of it. I believe so much in the Jackson Center. I tell you what, why don't you put a little sign up that says Windows by Hopes? And it's out there. As you walked in, you saw that. And I'll write you a check for $25,000. That's how he did that. That was the business. But I'm here to say that much of what got us going and the encouragement was that Frank took a flyer on us. He really did. We then were able to, we paid the bill, by the way, and that he took a flyer on us when we were new kids. We were just kids with a hope and a dream, and with Carl Kaplan and Betty Linnaeus and a lot of other folks who were all here in foundations who supported us. But he was really the first. Frank, and I just am so fond of the fact, and I don't know if I've had a chance to, certainly I thanked him when he was alive, but not formally like this. So I just want to thank Hopes, and I know there are many representatives here of the Hopes family, and Mary so much that, the support that Frank did to us, and Richie as the brother helping us, and Randy, you're carrying on the legacy, and Scott, and Kelly, I can't thank you enough. So I'm going to ask Kelly maybe to come up with just a reflection or two, and then we'll really get into the program.
It's hard to come after Greg Peterson, because he's a man of more words than I, and I have a hard time shutting up. But just thank you guys so much for being here. I want to welcome my mother and father-in-law, Judy and Bob DuBois. The word serendipity couldn't be more perfect for this place, my family connection to the Jackson Center, my family connection to Rob and his family, and all the fun things that kind of play into this. So it's a neat little way to reflect on a lot of positives. So excited you guys are here, and anxious to get a little history in us tonight. So we're taping it, so when our children are old enough to actually really understand what went on, they can watch it. Thanks.
There's a book that was put out not too long ago called An American Hero of the Holocaust. And its opening chapter reads, "For all its villains and victims, the history of the Holocaust also has its share of heroes, although painfully few. There were villagers who risked their lives by sheltering Jewish children. There were individuals such as Oskar Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg who protected Jews through an array of ruses. There were a handful of diplomats from Japan and China who defied their superiors by granting visas to Jewish refugees." But this book is about an American who was a different kind of hero of the Holocaust. Josiah DuBois Jr. was not a rescuer or a shelterer. He was a whistleblower. DuBois did not risk his life in doing what he did, but he certainly risked his career, and that takes courage, a special kind of courage that not many people possess. And the book goes on to recite what happened. And part of what happened, as an attorney in the Secretary of the Treasury, he prepared the report, which I mentioned earlier, an acquiescence of the United States government in the murder of Jews, which was actions that were taken affirmatively, some not so affirmatively, which delayed and impeded Jews coming into the United States. And he felt that was a guilty process, which in fact he offered up to his boss, Henry Morgenthau, in 1944. This is 44, in the middle of the war, that he was going to, gave it to Morgenthau, his boss, to give it to Roosevelt. And in fact, he said, if you don't, I'll in fact give this to the press. And that was a process that went on at that time. Morgenthau took it, and he reduced it a little bit, and in fact gave it to the president, which then led to the War Refugee Board and the admission into the United States of a number of Jews. That's Josiah DuBois, Jr. And part of that process, he's been recognized in many cases, and Bob and I will talk about that later as we get into that part of the program. But I'm so thrilled to have here in our midst, came down from Buffalo, is Rob Goldberg, the Chief Executive Officer of the Buffalo Jewish Federation. And Rob, I want to share a reflection a little bit on what this evening means. And I believe, Rob, tonight's the anniversary of Kristallnacht.
Thank you very much, Greg. It's wonderful to be here. I'm actually going to flip around and go back to Buffalo, and unfortunately I can't stay for the full evening. I would much rather be with you, but I have to go back for a meeting of one of our agencies for their annual meeting. So a couple of reflections to share with you. I just came back from Israel just a couple of days ago. We took 80 Buffalonians to Israel for a 10-day experience, and it was particularly challenging because of the Tree of Life synagogue massacre that happened 2 weeks ago this coming Saturday. And there's a couple of things that happened there that I think you will find powerful and inspirational, as I did and the people who I was with. First of all, we went to 2 Holocaust museums and learning centers when we were in Israel. The first, some of you may be very familiar with, Yad Vashem, where Josiah DuBois Jr. is honored for his extraordinary whistleblowing, if you will. And it's an amazing place. You walk into Yad Vashem. It's very wide architecturally, and there is video playing throughout your experience of children and families in Eastern Europe before the war. And then as you go through the museum, you're crossing. You cannot walk through the museum in a straight line. You have to go back and forth. The museum narrows. And then at the end of the war, as it tells the narrative, it widens, and you look out on the Judean hills in Israel. And the connection there is unique to Israel. It's a museum that is telling a narrative that ends with the creation of the State of Israel, which is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. It's a very powerful experience to go through. But there's another museum up in the north, near the city of Akko. Akko is on the Mediterranean. It's in what's called the Western Galilee region of Israel. And Akko, uniquely, is only 50% Jewish. The other 50% of the people who live in Akko are Israeli Arabs, Druze, which is a form of Arab religion, sort of a messianic form, Baha'i, and others. And it's an amazing place, but there's a museum started by Holocaust survivors called the Ghetto Fighters Museum right outside of Akko. It's a very different experience than going to Jerusalem at Yad Vashem. And that museum focuses on the resistance. And there was one thing I was sharing with Greg. They have a new exhibition, and in the museum is the actual booth that Adolf Eichmann was in during his trial in 1961 in Israel. If people know about it, Eichmann, who's considered to be the architect and engineer of the final solution, was abducted in Argentina, where he was hiding, as a Jew, by the way, brought to Israel, stood trial, and it was a turning point, actually, in the history of the state, because for the first time, survivors spoke about the atrocities, and prior to that, they said nothing to their children, to themselves, to their loved ones. And it was a turning point, and Eichmann was executed, and today is the only person ever to be executed in the land of Israel. All of that is a backdrop to what has been the greatest atrocity against the Jewish people in the United States just 13 days ago. when 11 people were murdered while in a synagogue preparing themselves for morning prayers on the Sabbath morning. And you've read all the stories. It hits the Jewish community deeply. And I want to share with you two experiences. One is that in Jerusalem, 36 hours after the atrocity, there was a vigil that was organized by kids. It was just amazing. You're walking in the marketplace, and there is this enormous vigil of candles and singing and this sense of solidarity that Israelis are with Jews and with the American people because of this atrocity. And it gave us a great deal of hope, and it filled our hearts with joy in what was a very dark moment. The second thing was this past Saturday in Buffalo, a number of young adults organized a solidarity event that happened in the city. There were about 200 people that were present. It was Saturday evening. There was a candle vigil outside. And one of the speakers inside was a Holocaust survivor named Sophia Veffer. Sophia is in her early 90s. She speaks all around the community. And she had one message. And the message, I think, is so appropriate for this evening. And that is, she talks about there were three people during the war. There were the perpetrators, there were the victims, and there were the bystanders. And there were far too few who were upstanders. And I think Josiah DuBois Jr. was an upstander. Whistleblower in one context, but someone who stood up to injustice, someone who said this is wrong. He wasn't Jewish. He wasn't personally affected by what was happening many, many miles away, thousands of miles away in Eastern Europe. But he stood up for what was right. And I think it's an inspiration to us as the Jewish community. And I just want to tell you before I dart out the door, on behalf of the Buffalo Jewish Federation, we are just delighted to help sponsor this evening, to have our name associated with the Jackson Center and to the kinds of things that you do on a weekly basis. And it's impressive and it's inspirational to us, and we're really grateful to everything you do. And I'm sorry I can't stay, but really thank you for the opportunity to say a few words tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Biographically, the events which occurred were 1944. He actually wrote the report in December, Christmas of 1943, Christmas Eve, 1943. He wrote. We'll ask Bob if he have any recollections of having any Christmas fun time with his dad that time. But he was working, and as I mentioned earlier, he could have put his career in real jeopardy in doing what he did. An upstander, that's probably the best example there. That was in 1944 where the report found its way, which ultimately led to the War Refugee Board, which ultimately then brought some Jews in, and they ended up in Oswego, New York. By the way, before I forget, there's lots of generations of DuBois here. You know, we have Bob, we have Rob, we have Jeb the third, Josiah DuBois the third, and we have Josiah DuBois the fourth here. So we have the youngest. So welcome. Yeah. So we welcome it. So as part of that, going a couple years hence, the Nuremberg trial starts, and the opening statement by Robert Jackson and many of the things you see here is in 1945, November of 1945, and the defendants in that case are right over here. This is the Goerings, the Hesses, the Jodels, the Keitels. That's the top decision makers of the Third Reich, and Robert Jackson was the chief prosecutor of that trial, which led to 18 convictions and 3 acquittals. And that was good, but not great. Jackson wasn't overly happy with the results of that. But nevertheless, that's the Nuremberg trial. It was the first time anyone was ever held personally accountable for crimes against humanity, crimes against peace. And that was prosecuted by a guy who was from here. Never went to college, never graduated from law school, Jamestown, New York. They knew they wanted to conduct trials against those who actually implemented the policies of these guys. These guys were the policymakers. They didn't kill anybody. They just didn't kill anybody. They were just policy decision makers. this is what we're going to do, this is our policy. And then they had 12 Nuremberg trials against the doctors trial. Judgment at Nuremberg, anybody ever see that movie, Judgment at Nuremberg? There was a trial against the judges, that trial. And there was trials against the industrialists, the Krupps, and I.G. Farben. I.G. Farben was, in fact, a chemical manufacturer. And we've got a brief clip we want to show, which we put together here at the Jackson Center, on a little background on the trial of I.G. Farben. And you'll actually see during the course of the presentation a guy who will be doing most of the talking. That's the chief prosecutor named Telford Taylor. He did the opening statement. But you'll also see over Telford Taylor's left shoulder a guy sitting in the front of the table, the prosecutor's table. He may look familiar. So we'll talk about him later. So if we could run that, Ed.
Destruction of the I.G. Farben explosives plant is part of the well-mapped Allied plan to blot out Nazi war industry. Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott, commanding the U.S. Third Army, oversees the job. 200 tons of TNT do the trick. Many of the buildings were constructed so that 2 floors were underground, well protected from our bombers. But now the job is completed and almost 80 buildings are leveled. The once powerful Nazi war machinery is slowly crumbling to dust.
Military Tribunal number 6 will come to order. Fritz Vermeer. Christian Schneider.
Schneider.
Otto Ambros.
Ambros.
Max Bruggemann. Ernst Bergen. Bürgen. Heinrich Bütefisch.
Bütefisch.
Paul Heffliger. Max Illner.
Irgenau.
Friedrich Jana.
Jene.
Hans Kuhne.
Kühne.
Heinrich Gattenow.
Gatineau.
Erich von der Heide.
Von der Heide.
Hans Kugler.
Kugler.
May this honorable tribunal please all defendants except Max Bruggemann, Karl Worster, and Karl Lautenschläger are present and in the dock.
The tribunal will proceed with the arraignment of one of the defendants who was excused from attendance at the opening session. The defendant, Karl Lautenschläger. How do you plead to the indictment, guilty or not guilty?
As it goes without saying that these men have not been indicted because they are industrialists or because they exercise great power and control great wealth. These things are not declared as crimes by the law under which this tribunal renders judgment. And this tribunal is not a forum for debate over the relative merits of different economic systems.
Please, the tribunal. The grave charges in this case have not been laid before the tribunal casually or unreflectingly. The indictment accuses these men of major responsibility for visiting upon mankind the most searing and catastrophic war in modern history. It accuses them of wholesale enslavement, plunder, and murder. These are terrible charges. No man should underwrite them frivolously or vengefully, or without deep and humble awareness of the responsibility which he thereby shoulders. There is no laughter in this case. Neither is there any hate. The first half of this century has been a black era. Most of its years have been years of war or of open menace or of painful aftermath. And he who seeks today to witness oppression, violence, or warfare need not choose his direction too carefully nor travel very far. This case, like any criminal proceeding, finds its justification only as part of this process of redemption and reconstruction. We have been told from the mountain to judge not that we be not judged, and we will do well to reflect upon and seek to comprehend this profound prohibition. The crimes with which these men are charged were not committed in rage or under the stress of sudden temptation. They were not the slips or lapses of otherwise well-ordered men. One does not build a stupendous war machine in a fit of passion, nor an Auschwitz factory during a passing spasm of brutality. What these men did was done with the utmost deliberation, and would, I venture to surmise, be repeated if the opportunity should recur. There will be no mistaking the ruthless purposefulness with which the defendants embarked upon their course of conduct. That purpose was to turn the German nation into a military machine and build it into an engine of destruction so terrifyingly formidable that Germany could, by brutal threats and if necessary by war, impose her will and her dominion on Europe, and later on other nations beyond the seas. In this arrogant and supremely criminal adventure, the defendants were eager and leading participants. In conquered Poland, Ambros was shown a town where one of Himmler's largest concentration camps had just been built. The town was Oswiecim, known to the Germans as Auschwitz. Ambros found the site otherwise suitable and was particularly interested in the possibility of using the concentration camp inmates to erect the plant, all of which was reported to the other defendants. They agreed, and construction of the Farben Auschwitz plant was promptly undertaken. What happened at Auschwitz during those years will later be set forth in some detail. Himmler, for a price, furnished the defendants with the miserable inmates of his camp, who slaved and died to build the Buna factory.
What you had was an introduction, brief. This is all there is out there in the public domain on that Farben trial, so we're glad that we were able to capture that and to capture the trial against those who were the directors and the chemists at IG Farben. Part of the great serendipity of this whole project that we pulled together with the Farrells and the DuBois is something I had no clue about. And that is one of my colleagues at Phillips Lytle, Nick Rotsko. Nick Rotsko said, when I was telling him just generally, hey, this is what's coming up, and he goes, oh, I want to be a part of this. Why? Why do you want to be a part and actually raise your hand to do work? Because I was going to do something I didn't want to do, which is do a book review. A book that was called Devil's Chemist, authored by Josiah DuBois, Jr. A book on the trial. How cool. So Nick said, I'll do it. I'll do the book review. He wins. He wins. Even I can say yes with the best of them. But when you inquire a little bit further, why did he want to do that? Why did he want to do it at an event which was sort of hopes related? Because his grandfather, John Rotsko, born July 29th, 1922, worked at, drumroll, Hope's Windows. He's a Hope's Windows legacy. And Mary Lauster, God bless her, dug it right up. And he was the assistant works manager for 16 years, starting as of May 1st, 1953. So, grandson of Hope's employee back in the 50s and 60s raises his hand to talk about a grandson, or talk about the grandfather of some grandsons who were part of Hope's. Can't put this together, you can't write this script, but anyways, ladies and gentlemen, Nick Rotsko.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me. As Greg mentioned, my grandfather spent the latter half of his career at Hope's here in Jamestown. And just to add to the serendipity, he was also a chemical engineer. But he spent his spare time reverse engineering things like silly putty to bring 5-gallon tubs of it home to my father and his siblings, as opposed to some of the more nefarious schemes that are highlighted in this fantastic book written by Josiah DuBois, that really is an extraordinary memoir of the trial. I should give you a little background on my practice. I'm a business litigator. I spend a lot of time doing business cases and white-collar criminal defense, as well as government contracts disputes against the federal government. This book it's written by a lawyer, and for me, it's very exciting because he's going into great detail on all of the contractual relationships and the board meetings, minutes, and correspondence, et cetera, that one often comes across in commercial litigation. That may be a little dry, but I think he's done a wonderful job writing the book by interspersing into that, more drier material perhaps, interspersing many excerpts from the trial and from witness affidavits and cross-examination, et cetera. So it's a very lively book, and it's certainly worth reading, and I do believe that even non-lawyers will find it to be exciting. Let me give you let's start by talking a little bit about who the defendants were and the charges that they faced. As Greg has discussed already, I.G. Farben was, at the time, a vast international cartel and conglomerate, basically, that spanned from chemical production all the way through to nylons, stockings, lots of household goods, Bayer aspirin. It was really an interesting conglomeration of the most brilliant scientific industrial minds in Germany at the time. And they branched away from household goods, though, and moved into some other, more difficult products that we'll get into in just a moment. The structure of the cartel, it spanned the globe. It was run by 24 directors based in Germany. And these were the 24 defendants of the I.G. Farben trial. They were all PhDs in chemistry. They were all brilliant chemists. And they ran I.G. Farben. What charges were what were they indicted on? What were the charges? The first was preparation and waging of an aggressive war, and that was coupled with an aiding and abetting charge. The second was plunder and spoliation of the industry and economies of other countries. And the third was enslavement and mistreatment and murder of humans, which included medical experimentation. These were very serious charges, and the unique aspect of this trial was that none of these men had ordered anybody to fire upon other people. They weren't directly involved in the military, and they weren't directly involved in the war. So how was Josiah DuBois going to succeed in demonstrating that these 24 men had been equally as culpable as Goering and the rest of the defendants in the Nuremberg trials? It's a very difficult proposition. They had a very hard time doing it. Let me move through some of the background evidence that the prosecution put forth. I'll save the results of the trial until the end, so that you can get a sense of whether you would have decided to determine that these fellows were guilty or innocent. The evidence of aggressive war. Collaboration between Farben and the Nazis started early. Farben was the largest contributor to Hitler's campaign, electoral campaign in 1933. Soon after Hitler lost, right, but took over seized power anyway, and soon thereafter, the collaboration between Farben and the Nazis started very tightly. The Farben established an Army liaison office that from 1933 through the beginning of the war and through the end of the war worked closely with the Wehrmacht all the way, all the way through the preparation stages, the rearmament stages, as well as the aggressive war period. Farben began planning for war industrial mobilization as early as 1934. At this time, remember, the Nazis were not supposed to have any armaments whatsoever. Farben provided virtually all of the material for Nazi rearmament. On the first day of the war, World War II, September 1st, 1939, when German bombs and tanks, the tanks rolled into Poland, almost every item that the military was using, from the incendiary bombs to the fabric in the clothing, to the rubber on the rubber tires, everything was produced by Farben. They had developed processes by which they could synthetically produce gasoline and rubber in Germany without needing to export any from elsewhere. Let's see. During this period of time, as I said, Farben was a vast international commercial operation. They had salespeople in virtually every continent. They had many subsidiaries in the United States. They had a vast economic espionage system, and they provided all of the reports that were generated for the directors. These were provided to the Nazis as well throughout the 30s. So, in other words, let's say you have a soap salesman in New York City. A Farben soap salesman was caught with aerial photographs of the New York harbor. What does a soap salesman need those for, right? They're sending them back to Germany to establish bombing targets for the impending war against the world, right? And leading up, just before, in the few years before the war started, just prior to the Anschluss, when Austria was annexed, Farben agents would roll into Austria, or the neighboring countries that did it in the Czech Republic as well, and essentially extort ownership interests in the major chemical and munitions industrial plant in those countries with the impending threat, or the veiled threat, if you will, that the Nazi war machine was amassing on the borders. So they engaged in large-scale industrial robbery. Okay, so it doesn't sound like these are very good people. So far, they seem to fit into the perpetrator category, excuse me. Now it gets worse, though. And by the way, this is all, I'm drawing this from the evidence that was presented by Josiah DuBois. It gets worse when we get to the enslavement and murder of humans. Farben decided to, after Poland was invaded and annexed, Farben decided that that Auschwitz was a perfect place to build the largest synthetic gasoline and rubber factory in the world. It spanned 24 square kilometers. Well, as you know, there wasn't, well, you may not know, but there wasn't a very large labor pool in the area at the time. The massive industrial works in Auschwitz were intended to be built with slave labor from the very outset. That was part of the plan from the very beginning. And the 24 directors of Farben some of them were involved with designing the plant. They all were involved in selecting the site near the existing concentration camp in Auschwitz, and they all approved it. The reason they needed to build this in the east was because the plan was to, the Nazi plan was to expand into the east and acquire Lebensraum, and just keep rolling, of course. So it was planned to use slave labor from the outset. They paid the Reich for slave labor on a per-head basis. According to Farben's own records, 200,000 workers or inmates died in just 4 years trying to build the factory in Auschwitz. There were 50,000 deaths a year, 200,000 recorded beatings per year, and this is all in the business records, by the way. Collapses from weakness they recorded these as well, they numbered 25,000 a month sometimes. The Farben had detailed records of killing people who were being used as experiments for vaccines. They would inject the disease first, wait till they hit the patients hit a delirious stage, and then attempt to cure it with the vaccine. All in the name of science, experimentation. And this is taking place at both Auschwitz and Buchenwald. I found this to be very interesting. Josiah DuBois highlighted statements by SS officers complaining about how brutal the Farben men were. Apparently, if the Farben camp in Auschwitz was actually worse than the main concentration camp. And once you were inside of the Farben works, you were subject to the Farben capos, who were more vicious than SS officers. And he highlights SS officers complaining about the Farben foreman beating the inmates too aggressively, which is I found that to be remarkable. So, on top of all this, of course, Farben produced Zyklon B for the Birkenau gas chambers. This book is very fascinating in terms of the level of detail that he does include. Zyklon B was an insecticide that had been produced for civilian purposes prior to the war, but it always was coupled with an irritant that was added to it that allowed you to know that you were dealing with a very toxic substance. And the packaging was stamped with a symbol indicating that it was poison. As it turns out, the vast quantities of Zyklon B that Farben produced for the Birkenau gas chambers, they didn't bother to add the irritant, and they didn't stamp them poison either. Just little tidbits like this that the prosecution team was presenting to the judges for months. I mean, they were layering on this evidence, right? I don't know if you're convinced yet, but by this time in the book, I'm pretty convinced that Farben that these guys were involved in some very bad things. Well, so let's get to the verdict. The day the judgment was handed down, the proceedings didn't start off very well for Josiah DuBois. He thought it was a bad omen when the chief judge, Judge Morris, started out by commenting on a major Farben plant that had exploded the night before and burned down. The judge, before reading the verdict, the judge addresses the 24 directors and says, extends the deep sorry, he says that the panel the tribunal is very, very sorry about the tragedy that happened the night before. Very sorry you lost your plant. Now let's get to the verdict. That didn't, Josiah DuBois thought that indicated that things were not going to be going favorably for them that day. And in fact, that's what happened. None of the directors at all were convicted of aiding and abetting or waging an aggressive war. And this is, the verdict was reached even though there were two Farben directors whose testimony in fact indicated that the Farben itself had a substantial influence on Nazi decision-making. And Farben, in many ways, they were so powerful because the Nazis needed all of the war material that Farben disregarded Nazi directives and influenced Nazi foreign policy. But everybody was acquitted of the aggressive war charge. 10 of the directors were acquitted of all charges, even though they had approved the construction of the Auschwitz factory that was premised on the notion of using slave labor. And eight of them were convicted of only the plundering of other nations, and not a single one was convicted of the mass murder, even though 200,000 inmates had died during the 4 years they were trying to build this factory. None were convicted of mass murder, and 5 were convicted of enslaving other humans, and that was really a slap on the wrist. They received 1.5 to 8 years. Those were the sentences, with credit for the time that had already been served. So some of them just were able to leave that very day because they'd been held since 1945, and this is 1947. So, needless to say, this is very disappointing. And I found the prosecution's case to be very persuasive. So it was a little surprising, the verdict. A very nice aspect of the book is that Josiah DuBois spends a fair amount of time with some rather intensive philosophical reflections on the difficulties they had in proving the case, but also what it was that the judges, what was causing the judges to in effect prejudge this case. If you read the majority decision, from a litigator's perspective, you know that this is a results-oriented decision. They had reached the result they wanted to reach at the outset, and they wrote the decision to supposedly support that result. You can see because they ignored all the evidence that I just laid out for you. And they stretch to make inferences in favor of these directors. It's quite remarkable. Josiah DuBois speculates perhaps, or just it was I would say I think it was very insightful, his view at the time. It's not just speculation. He believed that in the backdrop of this prosecution was the fear of communism, and this actually led 2 of the judges, and he received some inside information from law clerks later, that 2 of the judges had decided from the outset that they weren't going to, that they couldn't determine that industrialists could be guilty of war crimes, because we need industrialists, we need these industrialists, we need business to be comfortable supplying weapons and war material to our governments, because we're going to be in a fight with the communists shortly. And Josiah DuBois was very sensitive of that very risk during the trial. He and the prosecution team tried very hard to make sure that American businesses who are not engaged in aggressive war, the DuPonts, the Fords at the time, even if they're providing material to the U.S. military, would not be subject to future prosecutions if we happen to lose a war, right? So they didn't want to set a precedent where all capitalists who sell goods to the military goods to the government could be accused of war crimes. They were very conscientious of that, framed the charges very carefully, but still it was this. Josiah DuBois, he's very persuasive in arguing that the backdrop of the Cold War actually led to the acquittal of many of the directors, and only 5 were convicted of the enslavement. No one was convicted of mass murder. I could go into a lot of the technical details on the difficulties they had proving the case, but I think I've given you enough of a synopsis. It's a very good book. I would definitely recommend reading it. And I feel that these men were guilty. I can't fathom how directors of a corporation who are receiving reports on a weekly basis of how many people, how many more slaves they need to build their factory, how they have no culpability whatsoever in that. It's very remarkable. So, yep.
Bob, I'm going to call you to come and sit on that seat over there, the far left, my left seat there. And just so you know, why we're doing this now is the decision actually came out in 1948, 70 years ago today. And it was today, but it was just 70 years ago. And of course, this ties in with Kristallnacht, which is literally 80 years ago tonight. And so the fact of the matter is that the Josiah DuBois Jr. arc of his life sort of winds its way to tonight. And that's why I'm so thrilled. By the way, before I forget, we have several members of the Warren County and I should say Warren area lawyers here, Judges Skirta and Morgan, thank you. This is the Robert H. Jackson Inns of Court, and they made this part of their program here tonight, so thank you for joining us. Now I'm going to sashay over here, Bob, and you and I are going to chat a little bit. So you watched the movie there, and there was this handsome guy at the podium. It was your dad. What kind of reaction do you have when you see something like that?
I kind of tear up a little bit sometimes, or something like that. Just, yeah, it's been going for a while now.
So let's talk a little bit about your dad. When was he born?
He was born in 1912. He was born in Woodbury. He went to school in Woodbury. It was interesting at the time in Woodbury, if you did well, you got A's in your first half of your year when you went to school, I mean like grade school even. The second half of the year, you went on to the next grade. That grade just repeated the first half over again. And he did this through his whole time in schooling in Woodbury, and ended up that he was admitted to the legal bar before he could legally go into a bar to drink.
Your dream, guys. Don't tell Josiah IV that.
Well, his comment to me, and I was never a student that would have skipped, and they didn't do it at the time. He said, but if you're ever offered to skip, you're not doing it. And socially, this was not a good thing for him. But he, served for years, and he was with the Treasury Department at the beginning of World War II.
Before that, Bob, you went to law school. Where did you go to law school?
University of Pennsylvania.
Was that by the way, did his father, was he involved in the law at all, or what was his background?
His father was a realtor, and he owned a number of lumber yards.
Okay.
So
the idea of getting into, you graduated in 1934 from University of Pennsylvania, and what was his arc there? He finally ended up with the Treasury Department, but where did he do it? Was he a private practitioner for a while?
He was a private practitioner. I don't know that he did any private practicing before the Treasury Department. Mm-hmm. Between the Treasury Department and going to Germany, he was in partnerships with my two uncles who had a law firm. And then when he came back, of course, he went back into that partnership. And that law firm was located in Camden.
What was his assignment when he was at the Treasury Department? Did he have a specific assignment or role?
Actually, I never quite knew exactly what he did. Part of it was tracing down counterfeit money, and he spent a good deal of his time in Europe. Actually, right on the front lines, which I don't know what they need a lawyer on the front lines for, but he was up there quite a bit.
Well, there are some people who would like to put lawyers on the front line as fodder.
So.
Steve, am I okay to say that, Steve? No. Okay. So he's in this Treasury Department and finds himself. I know he was in the finance aspect of it and financial transactions. Did that kind of segue in doing that work into learning more about what was going on with the Jews at that point? Was there?
Well, during that time, the State Department was cleansing correspondence that was coming from Europe, explaining how the Germans were treating the Jews. And the State Department was cleansing it so they didn't have to do anything, anything about it. And they were cleansing it with the approval of the president, FDR. And even after they set up the War Refugee Board, the State Department dragged their feet at issuing the licenses or permits for the Jews to come over. And the Treasury Department ended up counterfeiting State Department documents and getting them over.
How did your dad kind of get aware of that? Did he talk to you about that, how he kind of had knowledge about going on?
I found out a lot more after my father died. My father's comment to that, yet generally if you asked him, he never talked about it. And he said, I only did what anybody should have done. That was it.
His memo, he prepared the memo as a Treasury Department lawyer, was signed off by his superior and delivered to Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury.
Right.
And the memo stated in part, the United States government has for a long time maintained that its policy is to work out programs to save those Jews of Europe who could be saved. I am convinced the basis of that information, which is available to me, that certain officials in our State Department, which is charged with carrying out this policy, have been guilty not only of gross procrastination and willful failure to act, but even of willful attempts to prevent action from being taken to rescue Jews from Hitler. And he went on to say, unless remedial steps of a drastic nature are taken, and taken immediately, I am certain that no effective action will be taken by this government to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and this government will have to share for all time responsibility for this extermination. That's heavy-duty language. And that was delivered, that report was delivered to the secretary, who in turn kind of shortened it, abbreviated, but then found its way to FDR. Did he ever kind of comment, or has anybody ever reported as to kind of what the initial reaction was when you hand this to internally from Treasury to State Department? Ouch.
I've never heard what the president's reaction was.
Yeah.
Treasury, Morgenthau was in favor of it, and Morgenthau was aware of it, being written, and was in favor of moving forward for it. State Department wanted to block it, and frankly, FDR wanted to block it. Was threatened to be made public, in which case FDR knew he couldn't afford to lose the support of the Jewish community, and set up the War Refugee Board.
Now, could you describe what that War Refugee Board was?
That was to bring the Jews over from Europe, and they settled them here in Oswego, and again, the Treasury Department drug its feet on, bringing them over, but eventually a number of them were brought over.
And they ended up in Oswego, ironically.
Yeah.
Just up the road, there's a camp. And I actually had a chance to interview a couple of folks who ended up in Oswego because of, now I know, I didn't appreciate all of this at the time, Bob, when you and I, we did this interview a few years ago, right? Jeff and Rob?
Yeah.
And I had no knowledge of this, so we didn't get focused. What I find fascinating is your dad, there was an interview, and it was an interview with your dad and Dorothy DuBois. Is that?
It's my mother.
That's your mother. And the excerpt of that said, in late December 1943, I prepared the report called Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of Jews, which not only described the incident, this is your dad talking, which not only described this incident of the cable, which was a bad cable, it described many other things that the State Department was doing with respect to not only suppression of information, but their whole attitude toward immigration and the murder of Jews. Dorothy DuBois then says, he wrote it on Christmas Day of 1943. Then he told Secretary Morgenthau that we had to give the report to Roosevelt, and that if Roosevelt didn't help them, Joe would resign and tell the papers all about what he found.
Yeah.
Wow. So he was putting Morgenthau right on the spot.
Yeah, but again, Morgenthau actually was supporting him on it too, so, you know. But
So-
he put him on the spot to make sure he gave it to Roosevelt, but also it was to make sure Roosevelt knew that it was going public, which my understanding has always been Morgenthau supported.
Is there any evidence that your dad, after you gave it to Morgenthau, was he on record any place to talk about what his reaction as it was sort of going through the process, waiting anxiously to see, I assume, what FDR's response would be?
I assume, but I've never heard it, and I was too young at the time to really, gather it.
Mom didn't say, well, I'm pretty nervous the next day we might be out of a job.
Could have been.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was just, and think about what's even going on today and how this plays out, that information. So it's a incredibly brave act, which ultimately led to the War Refugee Board, which ultimately did open up the channels a little bit. Since that time, and I know in the past few years, there's been a recognition, much greater recognition of your dad now of what he did with regards to this report. And what are some of the experiences you've been receiving? You're the son. Have you been going to events honoring your dad?
I usually try to skip them, to be honest with you.
That's why tonight we played every card we possibly could.
That's okay. Not only did you get me tonight, I have to go up to Orange, Connecticut next week for one. So
Really?
I skip them for years, and now I do 2 in a week or half or so.
So what is it that they do? You're the representative. You're the son of Josiah DuBois Jr. What do they say? What's the honor they normally recognize you or recognize your dad for?
Recognized for saving of the Jews. He did go to only one ceremony where they actually recognized him in Philly. And that was the last time actually that his whole brothers and sisters got together before, they started passing away. And that was back in the early 80s. They gave him an award for being a righteous Gentile.
Which is a huge recognition.
Yes.
That's the Yad Vashem recognition, and very few Americans have ever gotten that, and what an honor. Then, a couple years later, he's now gets an inquiry from General Telford Taylor, who was appointed by Robert Jackson as the chief prosecutor of the subsequent Nuremberg trials that we talked about. And I read someplace where he tried very hard to convince a lot of people that they would be better chosen than he to go to take on that Nuremberg prosecutor. And I think he even had conversations with his brothers or his uncle. I'm not sure, but with
it was his brothers, particularly his brother Herb, was not particularly happy about him taking this assignment. They had just started a law business in Camden. I'm not sure whether his brother Matt was with them yet or not, to be honest with you. But
decide he did, and to go to Nuremberg, and he took somebody else with him. You.
Well, I didn't go over it right away.
Okay.
My mother, he was over, then my mother went over during the summer of 47, and then the fall she came back, and we went over for a year, almost a year in Germany. I went to second grade in Germany. Fortunately, it was an American school because I don't speak German. But funny thing is, I played with a lot of German kids because the area we were in didn't have American kids, and most of them didn't speak English. So, but we found a way to get along.
Do you have what was your impression at Nuremberg? It was in Nuremberg, right? Where you stayed?
The school was in Nuremberg. We stayed outside of Nuremberg. In fact, it's the only year I rode in a school bus. It was like an hour and a half ride each way. But because they picked up a lot of kids in a lot of different areas and they were spread out, they weren't again, it wasn't a district. We had a house they had taken from a German general, and they also supplied us with a maid and chauffeur.
Where was this?
I don't know the address in Germany.
Jackson similarly had an experience. In fact, the desk out there came from a house outside of Germany, probably in the same area where they sort of commandeered a lot of houses. What was the city like? I mean, the city was, when you see some pictures right over there, Bob, of just bombed out Nuremberg, about 90% bombed, I mean, down. Is that your impression?
Nuremberg was bombed out, and we went through one city, and I don't remember the name of it, and people were living where walls had fallen up against the adjacent building. They were living under the fallen walls. And the city had been, I don't remember the name of it again, but the city had been one of Hitler's favorites and therefore became a favorite for bombs.
Well, and obviously Nuremberg was the same thing. Everybody dropped every bomb they had in Nuremberg.
Yeah. So there was quite a bit of destruction in there. While we were there, they blew up a bomb shelter that wasn't too far from us. I got to see that before they bombed it. And I always thought the castles were neat there.
Yep. Did you have any reason to go to the trial? Did your dad take you in one day? Or?
No.
Was there any conversation at all about kind of why they were there, or was it just you were young enough that you just went to school and eventually saw mom and dad later in the evening?
It was basically that. You knew why they were there, that he was in a trial, but you didn't know much about it. He always had a habit, though, of bringing his work home, and sometimes there's some pictures came home that were pretty horrific,
I bet.
which I probably wasn't supposed to see, but I've always been a little nosy.
A lot of laughter here from the DuBois. You were there alone? Did you have any siblings with you?
My sister was there. My sister was 3 years younger than me. I was 7. She was 4.
And as part of the trial, you were there, and then 1948, the decisions were made 70 years ago. And you come back. I assume, you didn't stay over there?
We didn't stay completely till the decisions were made, or maybe the decisions were made, but my father came home several months after we came home. We were actually home for most of the summer. Mm-hmm. We'd gone over on a boat, and it was a converted troop carrier, which had before that had been a passenger void, but they never changed it completely back. It was kind of half and half at the time we went over. And you stayed in a cabin that had like 10, 12 people in it. And, you had bunk beds. It wasn't exactly a luxury cruise. And we went through a tail end of a hurricane. My mother said she was not going back by boat. So we flew back. Spent a night in London because the plane had some kind of problem they were going to fix in 15 minutes. And they had folding chairs for us and kind of slept on a folding chair all night. The plane eventually took off when we got back, but it was a lot longer than 15 minutes.
Did you get a sense of any security while you were in Nuremberg? Were they because your dad was a prosecutor, did you have police?
No.
Did you aware of that at all?
Wasn't aware of it, and as I said, I was allowed to play with the German kids and, just go around the neighborhood. So it really didn't feel any need for security, at least I didn't feel it.
Was there any sense that you were being an American, they being a German, that there was any feelings about that, any emotions, that the victor, conqueror?
Really, right in the area I was, I didn't get the emotions. Now, maybe they were there, but being 7, I didn't pick them up. And a particular group of kids around there that I played with, we were all friendly and did go to each other's houses, so.
Yeah. Now, fast forward a few years, you're now in college, high school, college, you're growing up. When did you first come in contact with your dad had actually decided, and I read someplace where he'd actually decided when the verdicts came out that, not happy, that he was going to write a book, and he did write a book, and how did you know that he even did one?
Oh, the book?
Yeah.
I was there when he wrote it.
Really?
Yeah. He wrote that, it was in the 50s, and I was older at the time, and I knew the fellow that helped him ghostwrite it, Ed Johnson. He stayed down the shore with us. So, my father had been solicitor in Ocean City for years, so we spent a lot of time down there.
It's the definitive it's the definitive word on that trial that occurred 70 years ago. Did you get a sense of his emotion when he's working with this ghostwriter? Is he saying, God darn it, or anything that's sort of reactionary?
He was, till the day he died, very disappointed in the verdicts in that trial. He felt they got away way too easily. And he was always very afraid that history would repeat itself. That, this wasn't the end of it.
In what sense what part of the history would repeat itself?
The same thing would go over again, that genocide, what have you, and, it has to repeat itself, really.
Yeah. As to the function of personal accountability, as Nick recounted the highlights of the book, so many of the directors were acquitted. And yet there seemed to be this sort of overarching Cold War mentality, because the enemy at that point was the Russians, and perhaps there was a need just to sort of get rid of these trials. Did he talk about that?
Yes. I know he felt that there was a need, that they needed these to rebuild Germany because the communists would take over Germany if they didn't rebuild it. I wouldn't say he was in favor of that. I'm just saying that's what he recognized.
Well, I think that was a realpolitik at the time. I know we had several of your dad's contemporaries who were prosecutors at other Nuremberg trials here over the last many years, and they all worked incredibly hard to get convictions, or as much as they could, only to find that a lot of those convictions were commuted by the United States, because they just wanted, the Germans said, let's get these trials over with, because if you want our help, you got to get them behind us.
Right.
A lot has been written about, and a lot was where we saw the Werner von Brauns of the world and the chemists who were grabbed, who really did stuff equally bad as was evidenced in the Farben trial, but they were needed for our Nassau program. Did your dad ever comment on that?
No, never really commented on the ones that came here one way or the other. I'm sure he had an opinion, but he didn't always voice his opinions on that.
You got your siblings, children. You got your children here. You have even a grandchild, probably left. But as you are the patriarch of the DuBois mantle, and we've just learned a lot tonight about Josiah DuBois, really on two fronts. The incredibly bold action taken in 1944 during the war while Roosevelt was the president, and then to be part of history in the Nuremberg trial. What's kind of a message that you kind of give to, what would you give to your children? What would you say about Grandpa?
That he always did what was right. And that's a good way to live.
That's a great way to live. And Bob, I thank you for sharing this. I'm glad that we're one of the few that you've given your time to because of all you. And thank you for coming tonight to really share in this incredible little story of Josiah DuBois Jr. Thank you, Bob.